The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
It was bold, unapologetic, and wildly funny in a way television had rarely seen before. Fawlty Towers didn't just arrive quietly on British screens. It burst in like a storm, carrying chaos, sharp wit, and a level of absurdity that would later turn it into one of the most iconic sitcoms ever made. At first glance, it looked like just another comedy about a small hotel and its eccentric staff, but underneath the surface was something far more controlled, precise, and brilliantly constructed. What made it unforgettable wasn't just the jokes or the characters, but the strange real-life inspiration behind it, rooted in an experience so bizarre that it almost felt fictional itself. The origin of Fawlty Towers begins not in a writer's room, but in a real hotel in Torquay during the early 1970s, when members of the Monty Python team were staying there while filming. Instead of finding comfort and hospitality, they walked into an environment that felt almost like a comedy sketch already in motion. The hotel manager, Donald Sinclair, was unlike anyone they had ever encountered. He was paranoid, intensely rude, and seemed to operate on a completely different logic from the rest of the world. Small, harmless actions were treated as threats. Simple guest interactions turned into confrontations. At one point, Eric Idle reportedly left his briefcase in the lobby, only for Sinclair to assume it was dangerous and throw it over a wall, convinced it might be a bomb. In another incident, even something as minor as using cutlery incorrectly became a reason for correction, as though etiquette had become a matter of discipline rather than manners. For most people, these experiences would have been frustrating or absurd in hindsight, but for John Cleese, they became something else entirely: inspiration. Cleese observed Sinclair not with anger, but with a comedian's curiosity. He saw not just a difficult hotel manager, but a fully formed character trapped in real life, someone whose flaws were so exaggerated that they crossed into comedy without trying. Over time, these memories began shaping the foundation of what would become Basil Fawlty, the short-tempered, socially anxious, endlessly frustrated hotel owner who would go on to define British comedy for generations. Basil wasn't a copy of Sinclair, but an amplified version of that chaos, sharpened into something deliberate and structured for television. Where Sinclair was unintentionally absurd, Basil was carefully written to turn that absurdity into rhythm, timing, and escalating disaster. But John Cleese's journey toward creating Fawlty Towers didn't begin there. Long before Basil Fawlty ever shouted at a guest or lost control of his hotel, Cleese himself had been quietly developing the observational skills that would later define his writing. Growing up in Weston-super-Mare, he was tall, awkward, and naturally observant. He paid attention to people, to social behavior, and especially to authority figures and how strangely they sometimes carried themselves. This fascination with human inconsistency became one of the core ingredients in his comedy. At school and later at Cambridge, he refined this instinct further, learning to see humor not just in jokes, but in structure, tension, and timing. Cambridge, everything began to shift. Joining the Footlights Theatre Club placed him in the middle of a creative environment that would change British comedy forever. It was here he met future legends like Graham Chapman and others who would go on to form Monty Python. The humor they developed together wasn't traditional. It was intellectual, chaotic, and deliberately unpredictable. Instead of following standard punchlines, they experimented with breaking structure itself. This style would later feed directly into the tone of Fawlty Towers, where situations spiral not because of one mistake, but because of a chain reaction of misunderstandings. Years later, Cleese, alongside Connie Booth, would transform all of these experiences into something remarkable. Booth was not only his creative partner but also his then-wife, and together they built Fawlty Towers from fragments of real frustration, observation, and imagination. When the show first aired in 1975, it didn't immediately win universal praise. In fact, some critics were confused by it. The pacing felt too fast, the humor too chaotic, and the structure too unpredictable. But audiences saw something different. They recognized the precision behind the chaos, the careful construction behind what looked like madness. At the center of it all was Basil Fawlty, played by Cleese himself. Basil was not simply a rude hotel owner. He was a man constantly fighting against reality. He wanted order, respect, and control, but everything about his environment resisted him. His wife Sybil, sharp and commanding, constantly undermined him with effortless sarcasm. Polly, the calm and intelligent assistant, often became the only voice of reason in the entire hotel. And then there was Manuel, the well-meaning but constantly confused waiter whose misunderstandings turned even simple instructions into disasters. Together, they created a pressure cooker of comedy where every interaction had the potential to explode. What made Fawlty Towers so powerful was not just the humor, but the structure behind it. Every episode was tightly written, with setups that paid off in increasingly chaotic ways. Nothing happened randomly. Every mistake led to another, and every misunderstanding escalated until everything collapsed in on itself. This precision is part of why the series, despite having only 12 episodes, became one of the most respected sitcoms in television history. Even today, it is studied as an example of perfect comedic timing. But the journey was not smooth. The BBC itself was unsure about the show in its early stages. After the first few episodes aired, there were doubts about whether it should continue. Yet something unexpected happened. Audiences kept growing. Through reruns and word of mouth, Fawlty Towers slowly transformed from a risky experiment into a cultural landmark. By the time the second series aired in 1979, its reputation was already secure, even though only a handful of episodes had ever been made. Behind the scenes, however, things were more complicated. Cleese and Booth had separated by the time the second series was produced, yet they continued working together professionally. There was no dramatic public fallout, just a quiet understanding that their creative partnership still worked even if their personal relationship had changed. That unusual balance contributed to the final shape of the series, which maintained its quality right up until the end. Among all the episodes, one in particular would go on to spark lasting controversy. An episode involving a group of German guests pushed Basil into one of his most infamous breakdowns, complete with exaggerated physical comedy and references to wartime history. For some viewers, it was brilliant satire, exposing Basil's ignorance and lack of self-awareness. For others, it crossed a line, touching on historical trauma in a way that felt uncomfortable or inappropriate. The debate around this episode has never fully disappeared. Even decades later, it continues to be discussed, edited in some broadcasts, and defended by others as an important example of satirical risk-taking. Despite the controversy, Fawlty Towers only grew stronger in reputation. Over time, critics who once dismissed it began to recognize its brilliance. It wasn't just a sitcom. It was a carefully engineered machine of comedic chaos. Every character flaw, every awkward silence, and every escalating misunderstanding contributed to something larger than the sum of its parts. Basil's anger, Manuel's confusion, Sybil's control, and Polly's patience weren't just character traits. They were forces designed to collide. The legacy of the show extends far beyond its original run. It has influenced countless sitcoms, been referenced in academic discussions of comedy, and remains widely quoted decades later. Even though only 12 episodes were ever made, its impact rivals shows that ran for years. That rarity is part of what makes it so powerful. There is no filler, no decline in quality, just a concentrated burst of perfection. Looking back, Fawlty Towers stands as proof that comedy doesn't always come from imagination alone. Sometimes it comes from real-life chaos, from awkward encounters, and from people who unintentionally behave in ways that feel too strange to be real. John Cleese didn't invent Basil Fawlty from scratch. He observed fragments of reality and shaped them into something timeless. And in doing so, he created a world where disaster and comedy became the same thing. Even today, the series feels alive. It continues to be discovered by new audiences who find themselves laughing at the same chaos that once confused early critics. And perhaps that is its greatest achievement. It never relied on trends, never depended on timing, and never needed more than 12 episodes to prove its genius.